So we begin again from line 141 in Pope's an essay on criticism. Some beauties yet no precepts can declare, for there is a happiness as well as care. Music resembles poetry in each, as nameless graces which no methods teach, and which a master hand alone can reach. So there are some things in art which cannot be defined. Some grace, some spontaneous creativity, and these cannot be taught. If where the roots not far enough extend, since rules were made but to promote their end, some lucky license answers to the full, the intent proposed, that license is a rule. So sometimes rules cannot cover everything, and a great poet needs to be given a license, which Pope calls some lucky license, because these are happy flouting of rules which lead to an improvement in the poem. So, but license is not a rule. This is answered by the idea that lucky license can only be accepted. Thus Pegasus, a nearer way to take, may boldly deviate from the common track. Great wit sometimes may gloriously offend and rise to faults true critics dare not mend. From vulgar bounds with grave disorder part, and snatch a grace beyond the reach of art, which without passing through the judgment gains the heart and all its end at once attains. So great poets sometimes can do things which do not follow the straight road of the path of grammar, but as if the Pegasus is taking a shortcut and gloriously offending the rules. Great poets, great wits, they arrive at something so ingenious that it adds to the beauty of the poem, and even critics won't dare to correct these faults. So the idea here is that genius may flout the rules of art at times. In prospects thus some objects please our eyes, which out of nature's common order rise, the shapeless rock or hanging precipice. But caring poetry must still be had. It asks discretion even in running mad. So even though it seems at times that the poet's inspiration is running mad, but actually there is a method in madness. Even in running mad, there is some discretion. And though the ancients thus their rules invade, as kings dispense with laws themselves have made, moderns beware, or if you must offend against the precept, never transgress its end. So ancient poets can sometimes flout their own rules, just as kings may not follow the laws that they made. However, it would be dangerous for moderns to try to break these laws. So if you must offend the rules, then you must not transgress its end, that is, must not deviate from the final goal of the poem. Let it be seldom and compelled by need, that is, one should not very frequently break the rules of writing, only seldom, and have at least their precedent to keep. The critic else proceeds without remorse, seizes your fame and puts his laws in force. So if you break the rules very often, then you would be prosecuted by critics who would pass sentence on you as a bad poet. I know there are to whose presumptuous thoughts those clear beauties even in them seem false. Some figures monstrous and misshaped appear, considered singly or beheld too near, which by proportion to their light or place, due distance reconciles to form and grace. So sometimes there are critics who think that even the flouting of rules by the genius is to be criticized. But Pope says that something which appears to be a fault or monstrous, if we look at from very close quarters, if we look at the same thing from a distance, and then we see it in its context, its surroundings, in a broader frame, then it appears to be beautiful. So this proportion or this perspective is important. Critics must not examine only microscopically. Critics must also place a work in its perspective. A prudent chief not always must display his powers in equal ranks and fair array, but with the occasion and the place comply, conceal his force, may seem sometimes to fly. Those after stratagems which errors seem, nor is human nods, but we that dream. So this line is again a famous line. So those flouting of rules, which appears to be in great poets' errors, they are actually not errors but strategies. And even though we may think that Homer was nodding, that is, fell asleep, but actually Homer did not fall asleep, but we are dreaming because we cannot see the flouting of particular rules in the entire context, and therefore we cannot see how it is important. I am skipping a few lines, coming to line 203. Of all the causes which conspire to blind man's erring judgment and misguide the mind, what the weak head with strongest bias rules is pride, the never-failing vice of fools. So a critic must not be proud, because it is pride which often leads to a great number of mistakes or erring judgment, errors in judgment. Whatever nature has in what denied, she gives in large of needful pride. So there is something illegible here in the manuscript. For as in bodies, thus in souls we find what once in glutton spirits swelled with wind. So a critic should avoid pride because if nature has denied one something substantial, then it is usually filled in with gas. So, like if you have an empty stomach, then it would be full of gas. But if you have your stomach filled with food, then it will not be swelled with wind. Similarly, if a critic does not have qualities, then he would be full of pride. So a critic should avoid pride. Pride where wit fails steps into our defense and fills up all the mighty void of sense. Great ironical statement, mighty void of sense, that is, when we do not have sense, when we lack sense, then we try to fill this void, this emptiness with pride, when we do not have wit or imagination. If one's right reason drives that cloud away, truth breaks upon us with resistless day. So pride is here compared to cloud. And if the sun shines brightly, the sun stands for right reason. So if we can look at things rationally and the cloud of pride goes away, then truth breaks upon us with resistless day. As in a sunlit day, there is no shadow. So we can see truth in the face. Trust not yourself, but your defects to know. Make use of every friend and every foe. A very interesting comment that you never trust yourself. You never think too much about yourself but always try to know your defects and make every friend and every enemy useful to you. So this sentiment is very similar to what Dryden had said, that our critic is our best friend. It is those who criticize us, those who tell us about our defects. We should learn from them. They are our best friends. Because those who do not tell us about our defects or those who flatter us, they actually do not help us. They give us a bloated sense of ourselves. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. Their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. The Pierian spring was a fountain in Pieria, a district around Mount Olympus, and the native country of the Muses. So you should not only taste from that spring, but drink deep. So a little learning, one who has a little knowledge is often very boastful. That person boasts of his knowledge because having a little knowledge, he or she thinks of herself as very knowledgeable, very learned. But those who have a lot of knowledge, they know that that learning is vast, and they know only very little of it. So they are humble. They are not proud. But a proud man with a little learning is a dangerous person. Therefore, Pope's advice is, you drink deep, you do not only taste. So you learn as much as you can. It is never enough. So shallow draughts will only intoxicate the brain, like having a few measures of alcohol will lead to intoxication, but one who drunk at great length will be again sober. Fired at first sight with what the muse imparts, in fearless youth we tempt the heights of arts, while from the bounded level of our mind, short views we take, not see the lens behind. So when we have, in our youth, we have a little talent and some inspiration, what the muse imparts, a little inspiration, then we attempt to climb the heights of art. We think too much of ourselves. We think ourselves to be great poets. But we can take only short views. We cannot see the length. But more advanced, behold with strange surprise new distant scenes of endless science life. But if you learn a little more, and then you can see the horizon and how much there is to learn. So pleased at first the towering Alps you try, mount over the vales and seem to tread the sky. The eternal snows appear already past, and the first clouds and mountains seem the last. But those attend will tremble to survey the growing labours of the lengthened way, the increasing prospect tires our wandering eyes, hills peep over hills, and Alps on Alps arise. So here Pope is giving us a comparison. So like climbers, when they first climb a hill top or a mountain, and then he thinks that he has reached the sky, treading the sky, walking on the sky. But as he goes on, then you see that the path is very lengthy and labor is growing. It is hard work. So increasing prospect tires our wandering eyes, and he can see hills peeping over hills and Alps on Alps arise. That is, there are more mountains to be conquered. So the more you work hard, the more you find larger domains, to master. A perfect judge will read each work of wit with the same spirit that its author did. Survey the whole, nor seek slight faults to find, where nature moves and rapture warms the mind. So, in these lines from line 235, Pope says, who is a good critic? So, a good critic or a perfect judge will try to read a work in the spirit of the author, try to assess what the author's intention or meaning is. And he must survey the whole, that he must read the whole work and will not only seek faults, nor lose for that malignant dull delight the generous pleasure to be charmed with wit, but in such lays as neither ebb nor flow, correctly cold and regularly low, that shunning faults, one quiet tenor keep, you cannot blame indeed, but will mislead. So the good critic must not be concerned only with the ebbs and flows, but see how one tenor or one constant quality is maintained in the poem. In wit as nature, what affects our heart is not the exactness of peculiar parts. It is not a lip or eye we duty call, but the joint force and full result of all. So just as in case of a human figure, we do not praise its beauty by praising only one part, a lip or eye, but we look at the whole figure in order to appreciate its beauty. Similarly with poems, the critic should look at the whole poem. Thus when we view some well-proportioned dome, the world just wonder, and even thine, O Rome, no single parts unequally surprise, all comes united to the admiring eyes. No monstrous height or breadth or length appear, the whole at once is bold and regular. Here is an allusion to the dome of St. Peter's Church in Rome. This circular dome of St. Peter's Church was a marvel of architecture, Renaissance architecture, and it was beautiful because of its regularity. So well proportioned. Therefore, no single part juts out, or any height, breadth or length appears to be monstrous. The whole is whole. We can look at the whole of the structure at one glance, and it appears regular and beautiful. Similarly, the critic should look at a poem as a whole. Then he goes on to say that there is no thing which is completely faultless. As men of breeding sometimes, men of wit, to avoid great errors, must the less commit. Neglect the rules each verbal critic lays, for not to know some trifles is a praise. So, men of breeding, cultivated men, men of taste, they will commit less, so that they are not blamed for committing great errors. Most critics fond of some subservient art still make the whole depend upon a part. So, poets therefore cannot follow critics, because most critics do not talk about the wholeness of a work of art, but focuses on a single part. They talk of principles but notions rise, and all to one loved folly sacrifice. Then Pope talks about John Dennis, a contemporary poet, who was his severe critic, and Pope satirizes him here, as he also satirized him in another work. Once on a time, La Mancha's night, they say, a certain bard encountered him on the way, discoursed in terms as just with looks as sage, as ever could Denis of the laws of the stage. So here is a reference to Homer notes from Horace, Epistolar Pisonis. Quando que bonus dormitar Homerus, even the good Homer notes. The Pyrean string, a fountain in Pyria, and even thine, O Rome, the dome of St. Peter's Church, designed by Michelangelo. Denis, the son of a saddler in London, born 1657, was a mediocre writer and rather better critic of the time, with whom Pope came a good deal into collision. Addison's tragedy of Cato, for which Pope had written a prologue, had been attacked by Denis. Pope, to defend Addison, wrote an imaginary report pretending to be written by a notorious quack mad doctor of the day, entitled Narrative of Dr. Robert Norris on the Frenzy of Denis, Frenzy of FD. Denis replied to it by his character of Mr. Pope. Ultimately, Pope gave him a place in his dance yard and wrote a prologue for his benefit. So, here also, as in Danciard, Pope refers to John Dennis, a contemporary poet. Now, once on a time, La Mancha's night, they say, a certain bard encountered him on the way, discoursed in terms as just which looks as sage, as ever could Dennis of the laws of the stage. So, La Mancha's night is Don Quixote or Don Quixote, famous creation of Cervantes, the Spanish novelist. So once Don Quixote met a poet on the way, and he looked as sage as John Dennis. Concluding all were desperate sorts and fools who durst depart from Aristotle's rules. And this poet said that most fools deviated from the rules of Aristotle. Our author, happy in a judge so nice, produced his play and begged the knight's advice. Made him observe the subject and the plot, the manners, passions, unities, what not. Reference to the neoclassical doctrines of unities and representation of manners and emotions in a play. So this poet showed Don Quixote his drama, his play. All which exact rule were brought about were but a combat in the lists left out. What, leave the combat out? Exclaims the knight. Yes, or we must renounce the stagyrite. So the poet did not represent a fight because according to Aristotle's rules, actions like war or fight, battle, these were not represented in a classical play. So he left it out, and Don Quixote was very unhappy with this. Said, what, you leave it out? Yes, or we must renounce the stagyrite. If I do not leave it out, then I will be flouting Aristotle. Not so by heaven, he answers in a rage. Knights, squares and steeds must enter on the stage. The stage can never so vast a throng contain, then build a new or act it in a play. So Quixote argued with the poet that all these characters, knights, squares, horses, they must be represented. Thus critics of less judgment than caprice, curious, not knowing, not exact but nice, form short ideas and offend in arts, as most in manners, by a love to parts. So Pope's purpose here is to suggest that Don Quixote as a critic was worthless because he loved only one part of the play, that is the combat. So a critic should not behave in this fashion. A critic should not form short ideas and love only parts, but he should look at any poem holistically. Some to conceit alone their taste confined. So in these passages, Pope is talking about the defects of critics. So another type of critics, So one type is those who love the parts and do not look at the whole. Another type who like some conceit or some strange images or wits. Some to conceit alone their taste confined, and glittering thoughts struck out at every line. Some critics judge by the use of conceit. Now conceits were used by metaphysical poets. Conceit meant comparisons or witty images, and most of them were extreme comparisons, unusual images, which were not acceptable to the norms of classical poetry. And glittering thoughts struck out at every line. Pleased with a work where nothing is just or fit, one glaring chaos and wild heap of wit. So this is the description of poetry which does not follow classical rules. Poets like painters, thus unskilled to trace the naked nature and the living grace. So poets who think that poetry should be filled with a great number of conceits, they are mistaken, because then it does not look nice. It looks like a glaring chaos. So, like painters, these poets are unskilled, who cannot trace the naked nature and the living. The Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla commented that naked truth in language is covered with rhetorical ornaments. Probably Pope had this in mind. With gold and jewels cover every part and hide with ornaments their want of art. So just using a lot of rhetorical figures or conceits is not enough, because there is too much of artificiality which conceals the grace of the natural beauty. True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought but never so well expressed. These lines are famous, this couplet. So nature must be reproduced in art, but it is dressed to some advantage that is not bare nature. Art must work on it, which means that in a work of art there must be the grace of nature, at the same time the artificial beauty. So there must be a balance, a judicious balance of the two. Therefore Pope defines true wit, that is best kind of imagination and expression, is that which has both the natural and the dress. The dress means the rhetorical, the ornamental. And therefore it must give us the impression that that the poem speaks of something very natural which we always experienced but could never express properly. Something whose truth convinced at sight we find, that gives us back the image of our mind. So great poetry should be such that by reading it we would kind of identify it with something we had experienced earlier or always knew in our heart. So it would appear very natural to us. As shades more sweetly recommend the light, so modest plainness sets off sprightly wit. So there should be a judicious balance between plain style and use of conceit or rhetoric. For works may have more wit than does them good, as bodies perish through excess of blood. So, an allusion to Galenic medical science, I suppose. So if any humor in the body is in excess, then one may die. So if there is excess of blood also, it may cause death. So similarly, if in a work there is more wit, more conceit, more rhetorical figures than it can bear, then the poem would die. It would not be successful. Others for language all their care express, and value books as women, men, or dress. So, the third fault of critics. There are critics who value poems only for language. Some critics judge by use of language or diction. So they value books as women, men for dress. So these critics are like women who like men because of their dress. So women who do not look deeper into a man but prefer them by their dress. Similarly, critics who do not go deeper into a work but loves it or judges it by its dress or its language and diction. So the conventional idea that language is the dress for thought, and that idea is clear. Their praise is still, the style is excellent, the sense they humbly take upon content. Words are like leaves, and where they most abound, much fruit of sense beneath is rarely found. So if a poem is too wordy, too many words, then you do not get any substance there. Just as in trees which have too many leaves, you do not find any fruits. False eloquence, like the prismatic glass, its body color spreads on every place. The face of nature we no more survey, all glares alike without distinction gay. So, false eloquence or inappropriate use of rhetoric is like making use of a prism. When sun ray passes through a prism, then it breaks into 7 colors, the colors of the rainbow. So Pope says that then one sees everything in gaudy colors, but one cannot see things in their natural color. And then the following lines, they are important, because here Pope is saying what should be the quality of expression and how should critics judge language. But true expression, like the unchanging sun, clears and improves whatever it shines upon. It gives all objects, but it alters none. Expression is the dress of thought, and still appears more decent as more suitable. A vile conceit in pompous words expressed is like a clown in regal purple dressed. For different styles with different subjects sought, as several verbs with country, town and court. Some by old words to fame have made pretense, ancients in phrase, mere moderns in their sense. So in these lines, Pope says that true expression is like the sunlight, unchanging sunlight, which shines upon everything, but it does not alter anything. It does not change the quality of anything, because expression is the dress of thought. The idea here is that one should look at the proper substance of a word, its proper content, and not judge it only by its language. So expression is only the dress, the surface, the superficial element, and true expression always appears decent and suitable. That is, true expression, like normal sunlight, does not heavily change the substance of anything. But a vile conceit in pompous words is like a clown in regal purple. So kings used to dress in purple colored dress, and a clown who dresses in royal purple is looked upon as vile. Similarly, conceit which uses pompous words does not itself becomes noble thereby, and therefore it is vile or unacceptable. Different styles are appropriate for different subjects, just as in country, town and court there are different codes of dress. So the same dress is not appropriate for all kinds of people. Therefore here the poet is suggesting the idea of decorum. So an appropriate style or appropriate language should be chosen, and the same language cannot be chosen for all kinds of characters. I think Pope has here in mind drama rather than lyric poetry. He is talking about the idea of decorum. Such laboured nothings in so strange a style amaze the unlearned and make the learned smile. So those who use old words, ancient phrase, but which carry only a modern sense, they use language inappropriately, and they can only impress the fools, but the learned people would smile at their attempts. Unlucky as Fangoso in the play, these sparks with awkward vanity display what the fine gentleman wore yesterday, and but so mimic ancient wits at best as apes our grandsires in their doublets dressed. Fangoso is a character in Ben Jonson's play Every Man Out of His Humour. So this character dresses awkwardly and dresses in the style of the ancients. So what the fine gentleman wore yesterday. So yesterday's fashion, if it is imitated today, then it would be a mimicry, but not a true imitation. Just like if we dress in the manner of our grandfathers today, then it would be humorous and ludicrous. Similarly, in poetry, one must not use too ancient words or ancient style. I do not know whether Pope here had Spenser in mind. Spenser used ancient obsolete words, obsolete languages, which is of course a fault in writing, but because he was a great poet, so he could do away with it. In words as fashions, the same rule will hold, alike fantastic, if too new or old. So ultra-modern style or too old style, both are ridiculous and are not appropriate. Then he comes to another quality of critics or defect of critics, who judge poetry only by number or meter, but most by numbers judge a poet's song, and smooth or rough with them is right or wrong. In the bright muse the thousand charms conspire, her voice is all these tuneful fools admire. In poetry there are so many qualities to be appreciated, but these tuneful fools, it is these critics who look only at the tune, at the meter. Now here we are reminded of Ben Jonson, who attached so much importance to meter that he said that John Donne should be hanged for not keeping to meter. So as a neoclassical poet, I suppose Pope would kind of accept or support that keeping proper meter in poetry is very important. But I think here he wants to mean that one should not commit excesses. That is, one's judgment should not altogether be clouded by the question of meter or number. Earlier, the word numbers was used when referring to meter. So only this voice of numbers or meter was heard by the tuneful fools, his critics, who want Parnassus but to please their ear, not mend their minds. So they come to read poetry only to please their ear, which means they look only at the music but they neglect the content. As some to church repair, not for the doctrine but the music there. So in churches, particularly Roman Catholic churches, Pope was a Roman Catholic, beautiful music can be heard. So Pope says that some people go to the church only to hear the music but not to improve their minds. These equal syllables alone require the off the ear, the open vowels tire, while expletives their feeble aid to join, and 10 low words oft creep in one dull line. So Pope says that just for the sake of keeping meter, often such poets choose words which are lowly, or too many vowels which are tiring for the ear. And these words create a dull line, while they ring down the same unvaried chimes with sure returns of still expected rhymes. So always keeping to rhyme and meter creates a monotony and dullness. And Pope gives some examples. Wherever you find the cooling western breeze, in the next line it whispers through the trees. So breeze is always rhymed with trees. It whispers streams with pleasing murmurs creep. The readers threaten not in vain with sleep. Threaten. So humorously, Pope says that whenever you find a line that ends with creep, murmurs creep, then you can expect that the reader must have fall asleep, so it must be rhymed with sleep. Then at the last and only couplet fraught with some unmeaning theme, they call it thought. So the entire poem is written with such inane rhymes, and only the last couplet they assume or they presume that the last couplet contains the thought of the poem. But obviously it cannot present any great thought. So humorously Pope says, with some unmeaning thing they call it thought. So this is a criticism of inappropriate and inefficient use of couplets, where people have learned to expect which words would rhyme with which words. Because of too much usage, it has become very common, and therefore such poetry cannot present us with any thought. Continuing with the same idea, a needless Alexandrine ends the song that like a wounded snake drags its slow length along. So Alexandrine is hexameter. So probably the poem is written in iambic pentameter, and it ends with an Alexandrine, which is a longer line. Therefore, it is like a snake. Wounded snake drags its slow length along, leaves us to tune their own dull rhymes and know what roundly smooth or languishingly slow. Therefore, the last line, which is longer, it becomes a very slow. It has a very slow music, is the fitting end to this dull rhyme. And praise the easy vigor of a line where Denham's strength and Waller's sweetness join. True ease in writing comes from art, not chance, as those move easiest who have learned to dance. So, in order to have vigor as well as sweetness. So Pope here refers to contemporary poets, Denham and Waller. They were both neoclassical poets. They wrote in the neoclassical style. Denham poetry had strength, Waller's had sweetness. But all this can be joined in poetry when one can write easily and in an inspired fashion, not accidentally. Let me see if there is anything. Sir John Denham, a poet of the time of Charles I. His verse is characterized by considerable smoothness and ingenuity of rhythm, with here and there a passage of some force. Edmund Waller is celebrated as one of the refiners of English poetry. His rank among English poets, however, is very subordinate. For in Pope's time, they were important poets. So today we may look at them as very subordinate. It is not enough. No, harshness gives offense. The sound must seem an echo to the sense. Soft is the strain when Zephyr gently blows, and the smooth stream in smoother numbers flows. But when loud surges lash the sounding shore, the hoarse rough verse should, like the torrent roll. The idea here is that sound should be appropriate for the content, for the sense. So when something very soft is being spoken of, then the numbers should flow smoothly. But when something very violent or forceful is being described, then the sound also should be like a roaring torrent. When Ajax strives some rocks vast way to throw, the line to labors and the words move slow. So this is actually the idea of onomatopoeia, that is, the sound should imitate the sense of the line, the content of the line. Not so when swift Camilla scours the plain. Camilla, queen of the Volsci, was brought up in the woods, and according to Virgil, was swifter than the winds. She led an army to assist Turnus against Aeneas. So the verse moves quickly when Camilla is described, but it labors, it moves very slowly when Ajax is trying to throw some very heavy rock. Flies over the unbending corn and skims along the main. Here the reference is to Dryden's ode Alexander's Feast, or the Power of Music. Timotheus mentioned in it was a musician of Boeotia, a favorite of Alexander's, not the great musician Timotheus, who died before Alexander was born, unless indeed Dryden have confused the two. So these are learned references. Pope expects the reader hear how Timotheus' varied layers surprise and bid alternate passions fall and rise, while at each change the son of Libyan Jove now burns with glory and then melts with love. Now his fierce eyes with sparkling fury glow, now sighs still out and tears begin to flow. Persians and Greeks like turns of nature found, and the world's nature stood subdued by sound. So giving examples from Dryden, here Pope suggests that how sound should follow the sense. So how Alexander and Timotheus are represented in different way in their verses, in these verses, which proves that Dryden used appropriately the sound to go with the sense. The power of music all our hearts allow, and what Timotheus was Dryden now. As Timotheus was a great musician, Dryden also today proves to be well learned in how to create music in poetry. Avoid extremes and shun the fault of such who still are pleased too little or too much. At every track who scorn to take offense, that always shows great pride or little sense. So this is the general advice to a critic, that one should avoid extremes and should not offense at every trifle. So, as things seem large which we through mists descry, dullness is ever apt to magnify. Things which we see through a mist or through a cloud appears to us to be large. Similarly, when we represent anything in a dull manner, then it would be similarly, dull things in poetry often appears to us as magnified. So it is a warning to the critic that when judging somebody's poetry, one should not magnify the dullness in it. So we'll stop here today. If you have any questions, you can ask.